So, as I said, and I think I think we're all here kind of to talk about the IDR process. The No Surprises Act seems to have fulfilled its primary objective, which was allowing protections for members if they have surprise billing. I think there's still some work to be done there, but for the most part, that's been successful. So really, the focus is on this IDR process, and I'm going to talk about four levels of the government that are really kind of focused in on it. And what's kind of surprising about this is how many levels of the government are thinking about this IDR process. All right, so you all are all in the same boat with us, and it also sounds like you're in the same boat as some in the administration, some in Congress, and some at the regulatory level. So next slide. So first, from a policy level, and some of this is kind of what we know already. We know that this administration has been pushing this concept of pushing progress without regulation. I think some of us remember an executive order in February where President Trump said for every one regulation, he wanted to see 10 pulled back. Right, so certainly a sense with the administration that they're looking for deregulation. And if you think about the phases that this administration went through, right? First, the executive orders, and then you had sort of a information gathering by the agencies building on those executive orders, right? So we had a couple of requests for information and some kind of pulling from the industry about what to do next. Then we kind of had a segment where there was lots of kind of guidance being put out and FAQs and things like that. Again, sub-regulatory, not really regulations. And now, and somewhat to the surprise, right? Now we're kind of in a regulatory state. And so I think the thing to say about the policy level, like more broadly, is I think Zealous and certainly many of you have put in our complaints about this IDR process. I believe that some in the administration, some at the agency level are listening to those complaints, and there's definitely a push to try and fix that system. So if we move to Congress, right, we've seen a bipartisan bill that was introduced that was talking specifically about the IDR process and also ramping up the enforcement specifically on payers. Then we saw a group of Democrats that sent a letter to CMS asking them, and certainly like discussions that I've heard around the Hill. There's a lot of need for, they're looking for information about the NSA and what the problems are with that IDR process. So I think there's some hunger there. Another interesting thing that popped up with Congress is beginning of last month, when we were going through this continuing resolution, as if you remember, we were going towards the government shutdown, which happened last night. One of the House bills, in fact, the only House bill that kind of got proposed and voted on by the House, included funding for the NSA, and it looks like they have it specifically for the IDR process. So it does look like Congress is working with the administration to set aside some funds to fix this IDR process, which brings us to that third square, CMS regulations and guidance. Trump just came out with his first unified agenda. Unified agenda is a schedule of the regulations that the administration plans on putting out. The IDR final rule. Now, remember, under the Biden administration, 2023, that administration came out with an NSA IDR proposed rule where they were talking about revamping the IDR system, right? They're going to pull in the negotiations to be a part of that portal. They're going to digitalize that portal. They're going to streamline some of the processes. They talked about giving health plans an identifier that they can use to navigate the system. And from the looks of that proposed rule, which I think all of the industry more or less thought the intent was good, right? Like, let's clean up that portal. Let's make it easier to track. We shouldn't be getting dinged for IDR initiated claims that we never even saw until 2 months after they were decided, right? So we were all kind of, I think, more or less for that intent. And it looks like the Trump administration has dusted it off, and they're going to finalize at least parts of what was proposed in that rule. And if you pair that, right, the fact that in November they plan on coming out with a final rule, if you pair that with the fact that Congress set aside funding for it, it does look like the administration, the agency, is looking to push and focus on that IDR process and figure it out. We also saw in the last couple of months guidance come out. We saw the technical assistance. We saw some FAQs. Talk a little bit about the technical assistance later on. It looks like another layer on top of the IDR process, which is not in the regulations, it's not in the statute, but it seems to allow for a resubmission of claims based on errors. All we saw from that was the technical assistance, right? So we haven't seen much on that at all, not much detail, not rich, no kind of fleshing out of the process and what kind of forms and what kind of back and forth is necessary, timelines even. So really high level. But again, I think that's going in kind of the theme of this administration of putting things out at a sub-regulatory level instead of at the regulatory level. Finally, we still have litigation out there on NSA. We still have TMA3, which is focused on the calculation of the QPA, which hasn't been figured out. So litigation continues to kind of steer the policy. You'll see that every time a substantial court case is decided on NSA, CMS 6 months later, 12 months later comes out with like guidance that says, hey, okay, now we're going to do it this way. All right. So we've got all these levels: policy, Congress, CMS, regulations, litigations. Clearly, the powers that be think there's a problem here. I'll say that for our part, zealous on the operational end, certainly. Vanessa's team has been pulled in to talk to CMS. They've asked her to advise her team to advise on what certain parts of the system should look like. Zealous has written letters to IDR entities, so we're actively engaged in trying to push a policy of at least efficiency so that the decisions are not made on a failure of the process.